welcome to Free Science Fiction Stories. Today's story is The Unstoppable Tide, a gripping military sci-fi story that plunges you into humanity's desperate battle against an unyielding alien onslaught.
The city district stood in desolation, a decayed monument to a world that had long since crumbled. Towering skeletons of steel and concrete loomed over streets choked with debris, their facades weathered by time and war. Windows shattered like hollow eyes staring into oblivion. Rusting husks of abandoned vehicles lay entangled with collapsed infrastructure, the remnants of a civilization that had fled or perished. Once this place had been the beating heart of industry, a hub of production and progress. Now it was a graveyard, silent, empty, and waiting. But today it would serve a darker purpose. It was no longer just a ruin. It was the front line. Kade adjusted his visor, his HUD displaying heat signatures from his squad. Martel, Jansen, and a dozen other soldiers stationed along the barricades. They weren't alone out here. Somewhere beneath them, something moved. "Getting tremors again," Martel muttered over comms. Her power armor's servos whined as she knelt, pressing a gloved hand to the cracked asphalt. "They're getting stronger," she said, examining the readout from her extra sensors and relaying the data to the squad. Jansen, posted on a reinforced platform above them, scanned the sector through his long-range scope. His voice was low, wary. "Tell me someone else is seeing this. We've got fractures spreading across the street." The tremors weren't new. For days now, something had been shifting below the surface. Seismic monitors had been picking up irregular quakes, each stronger than the last. That had given them time to bring in as much extra hardware as they dared. Mortars and artillery had been brought in and pre-positioned to cover the largest of the areas in question. Barricades had been assembled, forming a multi-layered defense of the whole city sector. A red warning flashed across his visor. UAV signal lost. Static interference. Kade toggled through the drone feeds, but one by one they were cutting out. All of them. Static crackled through comms, followed by Jansen's voice. "Ah! Kade! I've got movement." "Where?" Kade asked, hesitating. "Everywhere," Jansen replied solemnly. Kade's blood ran cold as he checked his HUD. His squad's positions glowed in blue, but in front of them, the sensors showed heat signatures flickering, deep beneath the surface. Something was coming. Then the ground collapsed. The street convulsed beneath their feet, a deep guttural tremor rippling through the concrete like the earth itself was screaming. Then, without warning, the ground erupted downward in a thunderous roar, splitting apart as if something monstrous was clawing its way up from the depths. Pavement fractured and caved in, vanishing into yawning chasms that stretched wider with each passing second. Twisted rebar snapped like brittle bones as massive slabs of concrete tumbled into the abyss. Buildings groaned under the shifting weight, their skeletal frames shuddering before buckling entirely. One by one, entire structures tipped, their supports sheared away, collapsing in slow, agonizing cascades of steel and shattered glass. Thick plumes of dust and debris billowed outward, swallowing the streets in an impenetrable haze. In the distance, more sinkholes opened like gaping maws, devouring whatever remained. For a brief, horrifying moment, there was only chaos. The sound of the world tearing itself apart, the shriek of metal twisting under its own weight, and the distant, eerie keening of something else beneath it all. Then, from the darkest depths of the sinkholes, movement stirred. Kade hit the ground as a wave of dust and debris blasted outward. Around him, soldiers screamed, some falling into the yawning chasms, others scrambling for cover. Then the whistling started. It wasn't the eerie, distant calls they'd heard before. This was louder, layered, a harmonic symphony of alien voices rising from below. Deep, almost beyond hearing, it rumbled beneath them, filling the whole world with dread. Shapes emerged from the smoke, thousands of them. They came in a crashing wave, spindly and insectile, their 3 arms bristling with blades and talons, their pyramid heads rotating as they moved in perfect synchronization, climbing over wreckage and pouring out of the sinkholes like a flood of living nightmares. "Open fire!" Kade let loose a burst of high-velocity rounds that tore into the first wave, dropping several of them instantly. The rest didn't slow. The barricades erupted in muzzle flashes. Railguns thundered, their sonic booms rolling through the ruins. Heavy turrets spun up, unleashing storms of rounds that shredded the advancing whistlers. The air filled with plasma bursts, tracer rounds, and concussive blasts. And then the megabugs arrived. From the largest sinkhole, a shape loomed, 20 feet tall, heavily armored. Its chitinous carapace pulsed with bioluminescent energy, glowing a sickly green. 3 serrated claws flexed, carving into the ground as it pulled itself free. More followed. Some had whip-like appendages, others kinetic spikes, their limbs twitching with barely contained energy. The lead creature's head swiveled, its black, multifaceted eyes locking onto the human lines. Then it charged. Martel was the first to react. Her power armor's thrusters ignited, launching her into the air. She fired an anti-armor payload, the rocket streaking toward the nearest megabug. The explosion tore into its chest, sending a shock wave through the ruins. For a moment, it staggered, but it kept moving. The megabugs surged forward, their massive forms crushing wreckage and vehicles underfoot. Behind them, the Whistler flood surged, unrelenting, endless. Kade barely had time to think before they were almost overrun. The city district burned. Flames licked at the shattered remains of buildings, casting jagged shadows through the smoke-choked air. Railguns howled, their hypersonic rounds punching clean through Whistler carapaces, sending bioluminescent blood splattering across the ruins. Explosions shook the battlefield as artillery rounds hammered the advancing hordes. It wasn't enough. Kade crouched behind a shattered wall, his rifle barrel red-hot from sustained fire. He ejected the smoking mag, slamming in a fresh one. "Martel, status?" Her voice came through, strained, barely holding. "West barricades are crumbling. They're coming in too fast." Jansen's rifle cracked from his vantage point, atop a half-collapsed radio tower. His shots were precise, headshots snapping whistlers one by one. But there were always more. He exhaled sharply. "We've got movement on the rooftops." Kade turned just in time to see a shape dart across the ruined skyline, fast. His HUD struggled to track it, then another moved, then another. Too fast. They dropped from above, moving like twisted arachnids. 3 limbs extended as they sliced through armor and flesh alike. The first one landed on a soldier, its claws ripping into his chest plate before the man could even scream. The second tackled a gunner from behind, severing his spine in one brutal motion, a new or at least rarely seen Whistler. Smaller, sleeker, and packing a sniper rifle-like device. These Spirestalkers were very mobile and supremely adept at taking out high-value targets. Martel spun on her heel, her power armor's servo-assisted fists smashing into a Spirestalker's head. It shrieked, its skull cracking under the force before it twisted unnaturally and lunged again. Kade barely had time to dodge as another landed in front of him, claws flashing. He fired point blank, his rounds tearing into its chest, but it didn't stop. The creature's third arm shot forward, razor talons grazing his helmet, sending sparks flying. He twisted, his combat knife flashing as he drove it between the creature's plates. It screeched, then went limp. The megabugs adjusted their tactics. The largest one rose onto its hind legs, bioluminescent patterns flashing across its carapace. A pulse rippled outward. And suddenly, the Whistlers changed their formation. They were adapting. The front line collapsed in seconds. The battlefield had become a nightmare. Smoke, fire, and the twisted, twitching bodies of fallen soldiers and shattered Whistler corpses littered the ruined streets. They had been fighting for minutes, but it felt like hours, their weapons overheating, their minds pushed to the brink. The initial swarm had been bad enough, but then they adapted. Kade turned, instinct screaming at him that something had just changed. His rifle's scope auto-semicured as he tracked the way the swarm moved now. They weren't just charging. On the rooftops, Spirestalkers halted mid-stride, their angular forms twisting toward a new target. Instead of attacking individual squads, they picked key snipers first, eliminating the humans' eyes on the battlefield. Jansen's sniper team was already struggling. He had just watched one of his best shooters get ripped from their perch and thrown into the street below. The megabugs weren't just rampaging anymore. They moved with intent, bypassing heavy armor and targeting exposed weak points. One of them smashed into a barricade, not at random but at a precise, reinforced seam, causing it to collapse inward, burying a squad of riflemen alive. Another one pinned down a machine gun nest, allowing the swarm to climb over each other and rush through the gap like floodwaters. Martel's armor was caked in green, glowing gore, but she kept moving, her thrusters kicking in just in time to avoid a sweeping bioplasma projectile from one of the larger bugs. She hit the ground, skidding behind cover. "They're adjusting to our defenses. They're pushing us into weak positions." Kade clenched his jaw, snapping to his comms. "All units, fall back to secondary positions. Do not let them separate you." Then, the first aircraft fell from the sky. A dropship. A massive armored VTOL spiraled downward, its engines belching fire as it plummeted toward the ruined streets. Kade barely had time to dive for cover before it hit the ground in a deafening explosion, sending shock waves of heat and shrapnel in every direction. Martel coughed, her visor cracked, her ears ringing. "What was that?" "Spirestalkers." Jansen's voice came in over the radio, sharp, panicked. "They just took out air support." Kade risked a glance skyward. Another VTOL took fire, this time from the rooftops. They were leaping to the highest vantage points and striking aircraft mid-flight. One of them coiled, its elongated limbs snapping tight like a spring. It launched itself into the air, twisting through the smoke before landing on the hull of an incoming dropship. Claws sliced through reinforced plating. The ship's pilot tried to correct, tried to shake it off, but it was too late. The aircraft tilted sideways, smashed into a ruined building, and detonated on impact. Humanity had lost the skies. Martel growled, "They're cutting off our escape." Jansen's rifle cracked from somewhere above, a clean headshot splitting a Spirestalker's skull mid-leap. It collapsed to the ground, twitching, but its brethren took its place instantly. Kade reloaded his rifle and pushed forward, dodging through the crumbling debris, trying to find higher ground. His HUD screamed warnings. Heat signatures everywhere, seismic activity still growing. Lines of red tracking every whistler that moved. There were too many. And then the largest sinkhole in the district ruptured. The ground collapsed inward, entire buildings crumbling as something rose from the depths. It wasn't a megabug. It was something worse. At first it seemed like another hulking creature, another towering monstrosity, but as it kept rising, Kade felt his stomach sink. A Titan-class Whistler. Martel had projected what the maximum their physiology might look like, and she had gotten very close to reality. The size of a small building, its 3 massive legs planted into the ruined street like a tripod, its long arms covered in serrated secondary appendages. Its body was covered in biomechanical plating, not just organic armor, but something else, something fused. The familiar Whistler pyramid-like head tilted, scanning the battlefield, watching everything with chilling calculation. Then it opened its mouth. The whistle that followed was deafening. It was deeper, resonating through the metal and concrete, vibrating inside Kade's skull. The swarm responded immediately. The megabugs pulled back to new defensive lines, reinforcing positions rather than charging blindly. The Spirestalkers abandoned their individual attacks, suddenly moving as a singular unit, darting across the skyline with eerie synchronization. The standard whistlers adjusted their formation, no longer scattering under gunfire. They moved in coordination, covering each other's weak points. They were strategizing. Kade's blood ran cold. Martel barely managed to reload her cannon, her voice hoarse over the comms. "We have to go." Jansen, still on overwatch, muttered something under his breath. Kade turned toward him. "Jansen? Repeat." Jansen exhaled slowly, his rifle trained on the Titan class. "It's not just leading them." Kade frowned. "Then what is it doing?" Jansen adjusted his scope, tracking something at the edge of the battlefield. "It's establishing territory." A horrible realization sank in. They weren't just overrunning the city, they were claiming it. Then the western barricade collapsed entirely. The western barricade's destruction was catastrophic. The reinforced walls caved inward, torn apart by the relentless Whistler swarm. Concrete and rebar crumbled as the creatures poured through the breach, their haunting whistles reverberating across the battlefield. Kade's helmet HUD flashed red. The battle net was in full retreat. The entire district lost. "All units fall back to the extraction zone," Kade shouted into the comms, cutting through the panic. "Get to the dropships, now!" The command outpost was falling apart, its once secure defenses shredded under the swarm's pressure. Soldiers were running, abandoning their positions, dragging the wounded, while covering fire rattled through the smoke-filled air. Martel reloaded her cannon, her power armor dented and sparking. She planted herself between the retreating squads and the advancing swarm, launching a high-explosive payload into the nearest megabug. The round detonated on impact, sending the hulking beast staggering backward with a guttural screech. Jansen was still holding his sniper perch, taking precise shots at the Spirestalkers attempting to flank the retreating units. "They're pushing us into a choke point," he warned. "If we don't break fast, we're boxed in." The Titan class shifted in the distance, its monstrous legs bracing as it extended its serrated arms. The whistling shifted. Deeper, rhythmic, commanding. Kade could see it now. This wasn't a battle, this was a cleansing. The whistlers weren't destroying the district at random. They were clearing it, preparing it for something else. And if they stayed here any longer, they'd never leave. "Fall back, now!" Kade roared. The soldiers ran. The extraction zone was within sight, but the retreat was turning into a slaughter. Megabugs crashed through buildings, cutting off paths of escape. Whistlers lunged from the shadows, pulling screaming soldiers into the darkness. Gunfire flashed in all directions, but it was barely enough to slow them. Martel targeted a weakened support beam, firing a high-explosive round at its base. The structure collapsed inward, cutting off part of the swarm, but the megabugs kept advancing, undeterred. Then the Titan class moved at last. It extended its limbs, planting them deep into the ruined streets. The bioluminescent veins running along its carapace pulsed violently, the same eerie color spreading outward in rapid waves. "Go!" Kade shouted, grabbing Martel's damaged armor and dragging her backward. The dropships were prepped for takeoff, their engines roaring. The last of the retreating squads scrambled aboard, covering each other as they climbed up the ramps. The Titan class swung one of its massive limbs, crushing a wrecked vehicle into shrapnel. The shockwave alone knocked soldiers off their feet. Kade barely managed to catch Jansen, pulling him into the dropship. Martel was nearly impaled by a Spirestalker that leapt from the wreckage, its bladed arms slicing into her armor's leg plate. She let out a yell, twisted, and drove a combat knife into its eye cluster. She kicked its corpse off her blade, then ran. The whistlers were seconds away. The dropship was lifting off. Kade reached out, extending a hand. "Martel, jump!" She activated her jump thrusters, launching herself toward the ramp just as the dropship rose higher. The swarm lunged after her, clawed limbs snapping at her feet. Jansen fired one last shot, nailing a Spirestalker mid-air, knocking it away from her. Martel hit the ramp hard, barely catching the edge. Kade and Jansen grabbed her arms, hauling her up as the dropship banked sharply. The whistlers shrieked from below, watching their prey escape. Then, as if sensing the inevitable, the Titan class turned away. It had bigger plans. The city they had fought for was already unrecognizable. The skyline was gone, swallowed by tendrils of luminescent organic growth spreading from the sinkholes. They wrapped around buildings, pulsing like the veins of some enormous living thing. The district's remains were illuminated by the eerie blue-green glow of the Whistler's new structures. Spires of fused chitin and metal, rising from the ruins like bones jutting from a decaying corpse. It wasn't just a battlefield anymore, it was something else entirely. Kade exhaled slowly, his throat dry. "That's not a nest." Martel's voice was hollow. "It's a foothold." The dropships touched down at Forward Base Echo, a makeshift military outpost hastily erected miles from the now lost district. The landing pad was a mess of rushed repairs, wounded soldiers, and command personnel scrambling to assess the disaster. The smell of disinfectant and burned flesh was everywhere. As soon as Kade stepped off the ramp, he was greeted by a chorus of voices. "Medical team's over here. We've got critical injuries." "Where's the commanding officer?" "We need a status report. How many are still out there?" Jansen staggered forward, his sniper rifle slung loosely over his back, his steps uneven. One of the medics grabbed his arm, but he shook them off, his breath shallow. "I just need a second," he muttered. But the pain in his voice was unmistakable. Martel removed her helmet at last, revealing a bloodied face, blonde hair matted to her forehead with sweat. The servos in her armor whined as she flexed her fingers, assessing the deep dents along her exosuit's chest plate. "They almost cracked me open," she said, her voice quieter than usual. "Another hit and—" She let the thought go unfinished. A final recon drone had survived long enough to send back one last transmission. The screen flickered, the grainy feed distorted by static and interference. But through the flickering distortion, Kade could see the Titan-class Whistler. It stood in the center of the ruins, its towering form partially obscured by the rising tendrils of biomechanical growth. The spires it had constructed were pulsing, expanding. The growths spread like roots into the city's infrastructure, embedding themselves into what remained of the streets and buildings. Kade's stomach twisted into knots. What was it doing, he thought to himself. One of the officers, a nervous-looking strategist, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "We've been analyzing the structure it's building. The Whistlers have never done anything like this before." The screen zoomed in on one of the larger tendrils. The silence stretched. No one spoke for several long seconds. The weight of the footage hung over them all. They were changing the world. If they can change a district this fast, what could they do to a whole city, or the whole world?
Enjoy this story? Subscribe to Free Science Fiction Stories for daily sci-fi adventures.